Hi, I'm Jim Mercurio. This is my first time doing this, so forgive me if I have to use some crazy wipes or some MTV-like white flashes to keep us going. I'm going to talk to you today about exposition, and the reason why is I was working on a definition for screenwritingdictionary.com, which you should check out, by the way, screenwritingdictionary.com. And in the definition, the word information was always coming up. Like, it's information that the audience needs to know to understand the context of the movie, to understand the dramatic situation. Problem was I kept wrestling with the word information because the word information seems to give you license, or the writer license, to let it sit there just as information. And I kind of feel like that's probably not the case. I know there are people like David Mamet who feel like 100% there should never be any exposition. Any piece of information that sits there as information for information's sake. And I'm probably like 98% that way. I think there's always a way to kind of, or usually always a way to kind of figure out a way around it. Consider a murder scene where a murder has happened and two cops who are involved in the case are just passionately talking about the events. ABC happened. Like, could you think of a more like boring way to get out the information of what happened? But now imagine that a loved one had to overhear it, or someone had to break the news to someone who is important to the person, like a spouse or something. And all of a sudden, it's a little bit harder to say those things, than just ABC, just passionately. So that's a question you have to ask. So, taking that as an example, you have to ask yourself, who could the information affect, or who does the information affect? And usually, or actually always, within the orchestration of your characters, there's going to be a person who will come in conflict with that information or will have a reaction to it. And if you don't have that, then probably you have the wrong information or the wrong character orchestration. And the idea is that basically you can create subtext out of the information. So consider, let's consider a kind of B sci-fi movie where there's a scientist and there's some kind of competition going on, like a smarter scientist or a boss, and they have to explain the particle accelerator does ABC, and they say it, and the person says, yes it does. Like, okay, that's pretty boring. ABC, that's like the most boring possible way to give those facts. But now think of it, the person says the particle accelerator does ABC, and the person rolls their eyes, typical of you. And then they go back and say, well, DFG is a much better thing, obviously. And then the person says back, well, that's because you think HIJQ was always a way to do this stuff. And all of a sudden you see that there's a game of one-upsmanship, they're trying to outdo each other, and there's a little battle going on. So all of a sudden that information, same facts, same words, but they're in service of something. And that was a pretty clunky example. But even in dramas, this same thing holds true. It's just a little bit more subtle. In my classes, I talk about thinking like an actor. And two things that actors always think about when they're doing a scene or a moment or before an audition are two things: importance and communication. Importance is the idea that even if something doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal, to the actor it has to be huge. And if you watch Black Swan, which is a pretty cool movie, the Barbara Hershey character, getting her daughter to sleep, to rest, sit down, come in, eat dinner with her, are huge things. Like, the whole control issues are based around these things. And it's a nice movie, and she does a great job of making those things really, really important. But today, something even more important than importance is communication. Now, I know you might think, well, communication, gee, that's obvious, that characters will communicate, but let me be a little more specific. If you have intent, if you have a character presenting information or something in a way, and there's some kind of hidden meaning, and there's some kind of subtext to it, well, it can be super subtle, or it can even be like non-existent to our eye at the moment. But then the character has to be smart enough to be paying attention and get it. So, like, for instance, I was with my client this weekend, or last week, in Cleveland, and I said to him, hey, let's take a break. Let's take a 5-minute break. If he says, sure, let's take a break, then that was pretty boring, nothing happened. If I say, hey, buddy, let's take a 5-minute break, and he says, Mercurio, you got the attention span of a squirrel on crack. And I don't really know what the attention span is, but let's say he says that. And all of a sudden there's conflict because I said something and he had a reaction to it. Now, it might just be that he's angry, and that's fine, or it might mean that there's insight into the fact that I like to avoid work. So I'll talk about that. But the idea is, if a character in the scene can't pick up on the subtle nuances of the subtext, then they're not the right character, or it's too subtle, or you have to have a different subtext so that they can make sense. A more practical example would be, say, I'm a character and I want to start doing bank robberies. Maybe it's a comedy, maybe it's a drama, and I want to convince someone important to me, like maybe my brother or a spouse or a sibling. So I sit down and I break down the facts of what the bank robbery is going to look like. We're going to do this ABC. We're going to get some guns, and we're going to meet Ted there. We're going to get the schedule of the guards, and we're going to, all these facts. And it's really boring. But if in the middle of all those facts, the person says, "What are you talking about? Or why would you think I would do that? Or do you hear yourself?" See, if they respond to that, you realize now, okay, what happened was that person was actually not just saying facts. They were fighting for something. They were like fighting to make it seem normal, or they were trying to convince them by making it seem like it wasn't that like out of the ordinary. And the other person can be like, "No, you're not going to break my moral point of view. You're not going to make me do something like that. How would you dare think that that's something you could come to me and bring that to me?" Then all of a sudden, those simple ABC facts, which could come off as completely boring exposition, now all of a sudden they're conflict. There's someone fighting for something, and someone's responding to his conflict. So it's the two-pronged thing. You have to have the person smart enough to react to it. Here's a scene from Gladiator. This scene does a nice job of personalizing the information so that the audience understands why these fights aren't episodic, but at the same time, it doesn't just come off as like kind of boring explanation. This scene from Gladiator isn't the actual writing or the words of the screenwriter. It's just a transcript I found on the internet. After Lucilla finds out that the gladiator is Maximus, she goes to visit him to enlist him to help to overthrow the brother. And she's going in under the guise that she's a rich matron who's paying to have sex with the gladiator. And immediately he turns around and says, about the assassin, "I didn't know he would send his best." So obviously there's an issue of trust here. Nothing's really going to get accomplished until there's some kind of level of trust. So let's see how that goes. Maximus reminds her that his family was killed. She knew nothing about it, she says. Maximus says, "Don't lie to me," which is a nice callback to earlier when she says, "I always knew when you were lying." Now, he grabs her, which escalates things, makes it dangerous. It also shows that she was willing to come within his range because he was actually being held back by chains. So this means she was willing to kind of, risk and be vulnerable. And here, she explains her situation. "I've been living in a prison of fear since that day." Now, this could be information. This could feel redundant, but she's doing it in service of, "I got to get you to trust me. I'm going to share this with you." So there is some reason she has to fight that and try to connect. He says, "My son was innocent. So was mine. Must my son die too before you can trust me?" He releases his hold on her, which is nice because the only action description is the point where he does have, some trust with her. He's letting go of her. "What does it matter if I trust you?" And now this part is important. "The gods have spared you. Today I saw a slave become more powerful than the Emperor of Rome. The gods have spared me. I'm at their mercy with the power only to amuse a mob. Lucilla, that is power. The mob is Rome. And while my brother controls them, he controls everything. Now he has enemies in the Senate, but with the crowd loving him, there's nothing we can do." So you see, technically she's just laying out information about how the politics work and what can happen later on in the movie. However, it's in the service of like, you think you have no power. I'm convincing you, I'm fighting, I'm begging, I'm imploring you to see the power that you have. So later on, when we watch the fights, we realize there's a political intention to them, as opposed to just being like, isn't it fun watching, Russell Crowe kick some gladiator butt? That's the major point of the scene. But then let's look at the end. They oppose him, yet they do nothing. There's some politicians who dedicated their lives to Rome. One man above all. If I can arrange it, will you meet with him? And this is where Maximus is kind of being a victim. He's kind of not ready to be the hero. She calls on the man he used to be, all in service of, please step up and win the love of the mob, so we can get the Senate to have some power to overthrow him. But you see, though, that it's all in service of a person trying to fight another person to become active. It's not just information. It's not just, here's how Rome works. That was a pretty good scene from Gladiator, and I didn't want to analyze it to death, but it just shows you how a good writer can take information and make it personal to the people. In my class, I show scenes from movies where Ed Norton and Sean Penn are in the scenes, and you can literally see how they're crossing out exposition. The scenes are rewritten pretty much for them. Their scenes are better than anybody else's scenes in the movie. And it's like Sean Penn would never ever play a scene where someone asks him a yes or no question, and he says yes, or he answers no. He just never would do it. He has disdain for exposition. And that's the thing. I want you to have disdain for exposition. I want you to hate it. So if you see 100 times in your script you have information that are laying kind of flat, bring it to life. Figure out a way to put it in service of conflict. And if you can do this for 98 out of 100 times, your script's going to be 1,000,000 times better. And it also makes you write better dialogue, and it makes you understand your characters better because they have to be the ones responding to the information in the way that they respond. So you're going to find yourself with better dialogue, better characters, and better conflict. Thanks for listening.